The origins of tea in ancient China. The legend of Emperor Shennong. In the mists of prehistory, before empires or calendars, the land that would one day be known as China was home to forests filled with ancient plants. Among them, a particular shrub with small green leaves waited patiently for its role in human history. Its moment came, according to legend, under the watchful eye of an emperor known as Shennong, the divine farmer. Shennong is a mythical figure, believed to have lived over 4,000 years ago. Often considered a father of agriculture and herbal medicine, he is said to have discovered hundreds of medicinal plants. One day, as the story goes, the emperor was boiling water under a tree when a gentle breeze carried a few leaves into his pot. The leaves steeped in the hot water, releasing a delicate aroma. Curious, the emperor drank it, and felt immediately refreshed. That, they say, was the birth of tea. Whether or not Shennong truly lived or discovered tea in this way, his story reflects the way ancient people blended observation with mythology. Shennong's discovery is less about facts and more about values. Tea as a symbol of nature, health, and the subtle harmony of the world. In these early times, tea was not a beverage for pleasure. It was used like a medicine. The early Chinese saw it as a purifier, a balancer of the body's inner forces. And in the quiet moments of drinking, they may have felt a connection to something older and deeper than themselves. The accidental discovery of tea leaves. Accidents often shape history, and tea's story is no exception. If we leave behind the myth and look at anthropology, it becomes clear that tea likely began as an herbal discovery, an experiment by early forest dwellers. Imagine early humans foraging, chewing leaves, learning what calms and what kills. The tea plant, Camellia sinensis, was bitter to the tongue but oddly soothing. Its leaves, when soaked in hot water, gave off a fragrance that was both earthy and alive. It's likely that tribes living in the Yunnan region of present-day southwest China were the first to experiment with these leaves. They may have boiled them along with other herbs to reduce fevers, aid digestion, or simply stay awake during long watches or rituals. In this phase, tea was not yet a drink to be enjoyed, but part of a broader exploration of the natural world. Like fire or fermentation, it was an accidental blessing, unplanned, yet transformative. Early medicinal uses of tea. In the earliest written records, tea is mentioned not as a refreshment, but as a healing agent. Ancient Chinese texts referred to its ability to brighten the eyes, reduce fatigue, and drive out toxins. These qualities made it popular among healers, monks, and scholars. Tea's bitter compounds, like caffeine, theanine, and tannins, stimulated both body and mind. It could sharpen focus, help digestion, and act as a mild diuretic. Monks who meditated for hours found it helpful for staying awake. Herbalists mixed tea with other plants to treat various ailments. In early pharmacopoeias, tea was often listed as a cooling herb, balancing the body's inner fire. These medical views were rooted in traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, where health depended on balancing forces like yin and yang. By 200 BCE, tea had established itself in ancient Chinese medicine. It was consumed not for flavor, but for function. The idea of tea as a healthful substance still lingers today, from green tea detoxes to matcha lattes with health claims. Tea in ancient Chinese philosophy. Philosophers in early China were fascinated by simplicity, balance, and inner clarity. Tea fit beautifully into these themes. Though it was a leaf, it had meaning beyond its physical form. In Taoism, for example, harmony with nature was central. A drink made from a forest shrub, consumed without embellishment, felt close to nature and truth. Drinking tea could be a quiet act of humility, accepting nature's gift with grace. Confucian scholars valued restraint, order, and ritual. Tea, with its subtle preparation and service, reflected these values. In some writings, tea was praised for its ability to calm the heart and sharpen thought, useful qualities for anyone seeking wisdom. Even in early poetry, tea appeared not just as a drink, but a symbol of thoughtfulness, refinement, and peace. It was something more than water, but less than wine, humble, but meaningful. Tea in Daoist and Buddhist traditions. While Taoism laid the philosophical groundwork, It was Buddhism that gave tea a sacred rhythm. As Buddhism spread from India to China, so did its practices of meditation, mindfulness, and inner peace. Monks in remote monasteries needed a way to stay awake during long hours of prayer and contemplation. Tea was ideal, stimulating yet gentle. It became their silent companion, passed from cup to lips in the dim light of early dawn. Over time, drinking tea became a kind of ritual, slow, intentional, and meditative. Each gesture, the boiling of water, the steeping of leaves, the raising of a cup, could be part of one's spiritual journey. Daoist sages also found meaning in tea's simplicity. It didn't demand attention like wine or dazzle like spice. It was content to be what it was. In this, it became a symbol of natural purity, the Tao itself in liquid form. The rise of tea in the Shang dynasty. By the time of the Shang dynasty, 1600 to 1046 BCE, tea had become more than a healer's brew. Archaeological finds suggest that tea was part of burial rituals, often placed with the dead, perhaps as a comfort in the afterlife. Bronze vessels found in tombs may have once held tea or tea-like infusions. Though evidence is sparse, it suggests that tea was known to the elite, used in ceremonies and offerings. The Shang court, with its rituals and ancestral worship, would have appreciated tea's calming, reverent qualities. Its preparation could be part of a ceremonial cycle, performed slowly and with precision. This era laid the groundwork for tea's rise as a cultural object, not just medicine, but meaning. Tea utensils in early China. As tea became more common, so did the tools to prepare and enjoy it. Early tea drinkers used basic clay pots and cups, but over time, the ritual of tea required refinement. By the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE, 220 CE, pottery had improved. Simple cups gave way to lacquered bowls. Stone mortars ground tea leaves into powder. Boiling vessels became more ornate. These utensils weren't just practical. They reflected status, taste, and artistry. A well-made teapot was a sign of refinement, and its shape influenced the flavor and aroma of the brew. Even the act of holding a cup, with two hands in silence, became a gesture of humility and focus. Utensils were not passive objects. They were part of the dance of tea. The first written mentions of tea. Written references to tea began appearing during the Han Dynasty. The character, Cha, emerged in texts about herbs, trade, and daily life. One early reference comes from a scholar who wrote about bitter-tasting leaves boiled in water for health. Another mentions a tax on tea, suggesting it had economic value even then. But it wasn't until the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, that tea literature flourished. Before that, tea was discussed in passing, its bitterness noted, its heat described, its value understood. These early writings show tea moving from the margins of medicine to the center of culture. It was no longer just consumed, it was talked about, taxed, praised, and shared. Myth versus reality, tea's true origins. It's hard to separate truth from legend when the roots of tea run so deep. Did Shen Nong really sip the first cup? Or was it a nameless villager, steeping leaves out of hunger? Most scholars agree that tea's origins lie in the southwest mountains of China, particularly in regions like Yunnan and Sichuan. Wild tea trees, some thousands of years old, still grow there. From this cradle, tea spread slowly, shaped by hands and habits. Its mythologies, Emperor Shen Nong, divine revelations, sacred trees, reflect the awe people felt toward this plant. The truth may be less romantic, but no less profound. Tea was born from the land, discovered by observation, and nurtured by generations. Its story, like its taste, is layered and deep. Tea's role in ancient Chinese rituals. By the time tea became a cultural fixture, it was present in many rituals, from ancestor worship to formal greetings, from monastic meditations to courtly feasts. Tea was often used in offerings, poured out before a shrine, or placed before a tablet of the dead. It was part of birth rituals, wedding ceremonies, and even legal oaths. To serve tea was to show respect. Younger people offered it to elders. Hosts served it to guests. Monks used it to welcome silence. Poets, to summon words. In these rituals, tea was more than liquid. It was a bridge between worlds, between people, between nature and culture, between the seen and unseen. Tea culture in Imperial China. The Tang dynasty's tea boom. By the 7th century CE, during the Tang dynasty, tea transformed from a medicinal drink into a widespread cultural phenomenon. The Tang period is often considered the golden age of tea in China. It was during this era that tea first became a central part of Chinese identity, elevated from a humble herbal brew to a refined social custom. Tea drinking became increasingly common in both urban and rural communities. Markets sold bricks of compressed tea, which could be easily transported and stored. These bricks were often ground and boiled with spices, salt, or even onion and ginger, a far cry from today's clean steeped brews. Government officials, poets, monks, and common folk alike drank tea. Monasteries served it in rituals. The imperial court embraced it as a symbol of refinement. It became common to offer tea to guests as a gesture of respect. Even taxes were levied on tea production, indicating its importance to the economy. Tea shops and tea houses sprang up in cities, especially in the capital, Chang'an. These establishments became hubs for poetry readings, musical performances, and philosophical discussions, precursors to the modern cafe. This was the era when tea truly became a part of everyday life, celebrated in public and private, sacred and secular spheres. The first tea books and manuals. As tea culture spread across the empire, so did a desire to understand and standardize its preparation. This led to the creation of the world's first tea manual, written by the legendary scholar Lu Yu. But even before Lu Yu, scholars and herbalists had begun recording how tea should be picked, stored, prepared, and served. These early manuals weren't just practical guides. They reflected a growing reverence for tea as an art. Topics ranged from water quality to the shape of the tea bowl. Authors debated whether spring water or mountain stream water made for better tea. They described different tools: mortars for grinding leaves, kettles for boiling, ladles for serving. In writing about tea, these scholars elevated it to a cultural ritual, not merely something consumed, but something appreciated and practiced. Tea became a discipline, a quiet craft requiring knowledge, patience, and intention. Tea ceremonies in the Tang court. Within the Tang imperial court, tea ceremonies took on a new level of elegance and symbolism. These ceremonies were not casual affairs. They were choreographed events that reflected status, culture, and imperial power. Court officials, scholars, and foreign guests were often invited to these tea gatherings. Servants brought in fine porcelain, exotic spices, and rare tea bricks. The tea was carefully ground, whisked, and served in silence. Each motion had meaning. The court used tea to showcase Chinese refinement. Serving tea to ambassadors symbolized hospitality and cultural superiority. Every detail, from the tea's aroma to the curve of the cup, was part of a broader message: that China was civilized, artistic, and harmonious. These court rituals helped shape what would later become the East Asian tea ceremony, a blending of aesthetics, philosophy, and social structure. Lu Yu and the classic of tea. The most influential figure in tea history is Lu Yu, often called the Sage of Tea. A scholar, poet, and former orphan raised in a monastery, Lu Yu dedicated much of his life to the art of tea. In the 8th century, he wrote Cha Jing, the classic of tea, the first comprehensive book on tea in world history. This text covered everything: the types of tea leaves, how to prepare them, ideal water sources, utensils, and even the cultural value of tea. Lu Yu saw tea as more than a beverage. For him, it was a path to harmony, a way to align one's inner world with the natural world. His writing is both practical and philosophical. He wrote, "Tea tempers the spirit, harmonizes the mind, awakens thought, prevents drowsiness, lightens or refreshes the body, and clears the perceptive faculties." His work elevated tea from custom to canon. After Lu Yu, tea drinking was no longer just an activity. It was an art, a discipline, a way of life. Song dynasty and whisked tea. After the Tang came the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, a period marked by intellectual flourishing, artistic experimentation, and continued devotion to tea. This era saw the rise of whisked tea, a powdered form of green tea that was whipped with hot water to create a frothy surface. Sound familiar? That's because whisked tea was the ancestor of modern-day matcha. The song method involved grinding tea bricks into fine powder, placing the powder into a tea bowl, and whisking it with hot water using a bamboo whisk. The goal was to produce a smooth foam on the surface, an aesthetic feature that was highly valued. Whisked tea was often enjoyed while contemplating poetry, nature, or paintings. It became part of literati culture, embraced by scholars, painters, and monks alike. Tea competitions also emerged, friendly contests where tea makers were judged on their brewing skills, foam quality, and presentation. Porcelain and tea-ware innovations. During both the Tang and Song dynasties, the development of porcelain dramatically transformed tea culture. Before porcelain, tea was served in earthenware or bronze. But porcelain, light, smooth, and luminous, enhanced both the visual and sensory experience of tea. The Song dynasty favored black-glazed tea bowls, which contrasted beautifully with the bright green foam of whisked tea. These bowls weren't just functional, they were artistic statements. Artisans crafted teapots, cups, and utensils with precise attention to form and glaze. The shape of a cup affected how aroma concentrated. The thickness influenced heat retention. Different regions specialized in different styles. Yixing clay pots, Jianware bowls, and Dingware cups all became legendary. This era established a tradition of teaware as art, where function and beauty blended seamlessly. Monasteries as tea centers. While the imperial court shaped the public face of tea, it was within Buddhist monasteries that tea drinking became truly spiritual. Monks drank tea during long meditation sessions to maintain alertness. But more than that, tea became part of their daily rituals, a moment of mindfulness, calm, and presence. Monasteries also served as tea production centers. Monks tended to tea gardens, perfected processing techniques, and hosted guests from all walks of life. Some of the earliest tea literature was preserved in temple libraries. Monks copied scrolls on tea, experimented with brewing methods, and passed their knowledge from generation to generation. Tea was not just a stimulant. It was a tool for awakening, a quiet companion on the path to enlightenment. Tea in Chinese poetry and art. Tea inspired generations of Chinese poets, painters, and calligraphers. In the hands of these artists, tea became a metaphor for transience, serenity, and reflection. Poems celebrated the way steam curled from a cup, how moonlight danced on the surface of a brew, or how tea soothed a restless heart. Painters depicted scholars sipping tea by a bamboo grove, or monks sharing tea in a mountain retreat. In visual art, the tea setting became a symbol of scholarly life, simple, quiet, and connected to nature. Scroll paintings showed serene tea gatherings, with minimal lines and muted colors. These artistic depictions weren't just decorative. They reflected a belief that tea was part of a cultivated life, a bridge between nature, thought, and emotion. Tea as tribute to the emperor. Tea became an imperial symbol during the Tang and Song dynasties. Local governors and tea-growing regions were often required to send the best tea as tribute to the emperor. These tribute teas were grown in select areas, handpicked, and processed with extreme care. Special teams oversaw their transport to the capital. Some teas were so prized that they were kept in locked chests and guarded like treasure. Offering tea to the emperor was not just political, it was spiritual. It reflected the belief that the emperor was the son of heaven, and thus worthy of the most pure, refined, and sacred gifts. In return, the emperor often rewarded tea producers with honors or land. This system helped formalize and elevate tea farming and processing into a national craft. From elite drink to common brew. Though tea began as an elite item, by the late Tang and Song periods it had become a household staple. Street vendors sold tea in crowded markets. Farmers drank it to stay awake in the fields. Sailors sipped it to ward off cold and fatigue. Affordable tea bricks made it possible to store, transport, and brew tea across vast distances. This democratization of tea marked a major cultural shift. It was no longer just for monks, scholars, or nobles. Yet even among commoners, tea was never simply a drink. It was served to guests with care, used in family rituals, and enjoyed during quiet moments. By the end of the Song dynasty, tea had become woven into every level of Chinese society, a gentle thread connecting emperors and laborers, monks and merchants. Tea travels to Japan. 1. Early contact. Chinese influence on Japanese tea. Tea first came to Japan during the Noro period, 710 to 794 CE, primarily through Buddhist monks who traveled to China to study. These monks returned not only with scriptures and rituals but also with tea seeds and knowledge of tea preparation. The earliest Japanese tea practices mirrored those of Tang China, boiling tea bricks, whisking powdered tea, and using tea in monastic settings. Tea was rare and reserved for the imperial family, high clergy, and scholars. In fact, tea was so novel that it was often treated as a medicine, offered in small doses for health and vitality. There were no tea shops, no gardens yet, just scattered seeds planted in temple courtyards. Still, this early influence laid the foundation for what would become a uniquely Japanese tea tradition, evolving separately but always looking back to its Chinese roots. Saiche, Kai, and the monk messengers. Two of the most influential figures in the transmission of tea to Japan were the monks Saiche and Kai. They traveled to China in the early 9th century and brought back more than religion. They brought culture, poetry, and tea. Saiche planted tea seeds at Mount Hiei, where he founded the Tendai sect of Buddhism. His temple grounds became one of the earliest tea-growing sites in Japan. Kai, founder of Shingon Buddhism, introduced ritual elements from Chinese esoteric Buddhism, where tea was consumed before long meditations. In his lineage, tea was not a refreshment, it was a spiritual aid. These monk messengers viewed tea not as a luxury, but as a sacred component of mental discipline and purity. Their writings and teachings helped establish tea not just as a drink, but as a philosophical practice in early Japan. Heian period, tea as elite ritual. During the Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, tea remained confined to the imperial court and monasteries. The capital, Heian Ky, modern-day Kyoto, became a cultural center where tea was served in formal, ceremonial settings. Tea was prepared in a way reminiscent of Tang China, boiled from bricks, sometimes with herbs or salt. However, because tea was still rare and expensive, it was not part of daily life for most people. Within the court, tea was a prestige symbol. Drinking it was an act of sophistication and connection to Chinese culture. Scholars and nobles treated it almost like wine, something savored in special gatherings. Court poets referenced tea in waka poetry, and palace kitchens carefully stored what little tea they had. Though it wasn't yet fully integrated into Japanese culture, tea was beginning to find its voice. Izai and the Zen Buddhist tea revival. A pivotal moment in Japanese tea history came in the late 12th century, when the monk Izai returned from China and brought back not only tea seeds, but also a vision. Izai introduced Rinzai Zen Buddhism to Japan and promoted tea as an essential part of the Zen lifestyle. He believed tea cleared the mind, improved meditation, and strengthened health. In 1211, Izai wrote Kissa Aiki, Drinking Tea for Health, a short but influential book that outlined tea's medical and spiritual benefits. He encouraged its cultivation near temples and prescribed it for fatigue, indigestion, and lack of focus. Izai also gifted tea plants to Shikun Minamoto no Sanetomo, helping introduce tea to the warrior class. From this point on, tea was no longer just for monks. It began to spread among samurai and aristocrats, sowing seeds of a national tradition. Samurai and tea, the warrior's brew. The Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333, saw the rise of the samurai class, and with it, a new role for tea as the drink of warriors. Samurai, trained in discipline and battle, were naturally drawn to the Zen philosophy of clarity and detachment. Tea became their companion before battles, during meditations, and in courtly life. Drinking tea was believed to sharpen the mind and calm the nerves, qualities ideal for warriors. Samurai leaders like Ashikaga Yoshimitsu hosted tea gatherings that combined martial pride with artistic refinement. Tea rooms became places not just for drinking, but for testing character, hosting strategy meetings, and honoring ancestors. The warrior's relationship with tea helped solidify its stoic, ritualistic nature in Japan. The rise of tea gardens and domestic cultivation. Initially, tea plants in Japan were confined to temple gardens. But by the Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573, tea cultivation expanded, becoming a domestic crop grown in various provinces. New techniques improved yield and quality. Shaded growing methods, early forms of tencha, which would later become matcha, were developed to enhance flavor and color. The establishment of Uji as a premier tea-producing region was crucial. Its climate, soil, and proximity to Kyoto made it the heart of Japanese tea. Uji tea was prized by nobles and shoguns alike. Tea houses also emerged as semi-public spaces where people could gather for chinoyu, tea gatherings, exchange poetry, and practice calligraphy. These gardens weren't just agricultural. They were cultural spaces where aesthetics and agriculture met. Ashikaga shogunate and cultural tea gatherings. Under the Ashikaga shoguns, particularly Ashikaga Yoshimitsu and Yoshimasa, tea culture became synonymous with artistic refinement. The ruling class used tea gatherings to promote taste, diplomacy, and aesthetics. These early chinoyu ceremonies involved matcha, powdered tea whisked into a frothy brew. The setting was lavish: gold leaf screens, Chinese ceramics, incense, and rare scrolls. Guests were carefully chosen, and every movement was rehearsed. Tea became a reflection of one's cultural literacy. Knowing how to behave in a tea gathering, how to admire a bowl or recite a poem, became marks of status. The Ashikaga court also established tea schools and invited artisans to craft specialized teaware. This laid the groundwork for a formalized tea tradition, one that merged politics, art, and philosophy. Marotta Juk and the birth of wabi-cha. A quiet revolution began with Marotta Juk, 1423 to 1502, a monk and tea master who rejected the extravagance of the shogun's tea in favor of simplicity, humility, and imperfection. He introduced the concept of wabi-cha, a tea practice based on the Zen ideals of wabi, quiet austerity, and sabai, beauty in age and imperfection. Juk replaced Chinese gold and luxury with rough clay bowls, bamboo utensils, and thatched tea huts. The tea room became a spiritual refuge, a place to leave behind worldly concerns and connect with nature and oneself. Guests entered through low doors, removed weapons, and shared silence. Wabi-cha became a philosophy of life, elegant yet modest, formal yet warm. It would later be perfected by Sen no Reiki, but its roots were planted by Juk, whose approach turned tea from courtly display to spiritual art. The evolution of the tea ceremony, chinoyu. By guests followed a strict protocol: how to enter the room, where to sit, how to handle the tea bowl. Every action, pouring water, cleaning the whisk, bowing, carried symbolic meaning. Teaware was curated like art, not for flashiness, but for texture, asymmetry, and soul. A cracked bowl might be more treasured than a flawless one, because it had wabi-sabi, depth and honesty. The tea ceremony became a mirror of Japanese values: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. It was meditation in motion. This evolution culminated in the work of Sen no Reiki, the great master who would define the tea ceremony's essence in the next century. Tea in Japanese daily life. The 16th century, the Japanese tea ceremony, or chinoyu, had become a codified ritual. It fused Zen Buddhism, artistic appreciation, and precise etiquette into a singular experience. Though tea began in Japan as a spiritual practice and aristocratic art, it eventually became part of everyday life. Today, tea is everywhere in Japan, from formal ceremonies to train stations, from quiet homes to busy offices. Different forms of tea evolved for different settings. Matcha for ceremonial use. Sencha, steeped leaf tea, for daily drinking. Genmaicha, with roasted rice, for comfort. Jika, roasted tea, for children and the elderly. Tea is offered to guests, sipped after meals, served in business meetings, and used in festivals. It marks moments of greeting, farewell, celebration, and mourning. Yet even in the most casual cup, there's a whisper of tradition, a sense that tea connects the present to a long, quiet past of monks, warriors, and poets. The spread of tea along the Silk Road. The Silk Road, a cultural superhighway. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a vast network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. It was along these dusty paths and dangerous mountain passes that tea began its slow westward journey. From bustling Chinese cities like Chang'an, modern Lebanon, caravans loaded with silks, spices, porcelain, and tea set off toward the unknown. These caravans often included camels, merchants, guards, translators, and monks. The journey could take months or even years. But trade wasn't just about goods. The Silk Road was a crossroads of civilizations, a place where languages mixed, recipes were swapped, and ideas flowed like rivers. Tea became one such idea, introduced gradually into the customs and diets of new lands. Tea as tribute, gifting across borders. One of the earliest ways tea moved westward was not through trade, but through tribute. Chinese emperors, especially during the Tang and Song dynasties, would send finely crafted tea bricks and powdered tea as gifts to foreign rulers and diplomats. These gifts were meant to impress, a show of refinement, wealth, and goodwill. Receiving tea from the Emperor of China was a mark of high honor, and many Central Asian, Tibetan, and even Persian rulers were introduced to tea this way. Tea bricks, compressed and sometimes inscribed with dragons or calligraphy, were both decorative and practical for long-distance travel. They could be used as currency, medicine, or slowly brewed over campfires. In this way, tea traveled not just as a commodity, but as a symbol of peace, culture, and prestige. The Tibetan Plateau, tea with butter and salt. One of the most fascinating chapters in tea's journey west is its transformation in Tibet. High on the Tibetan Plateau, where the air is thin and the climate harsh, tea was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Tibetan tea culture adapted to local needs. Instead of delicate infusions, tea was boiled for hours with water, yak butter, and salt, creating a rich, creamy drink called po-cha. It provided calories, hydration, and warmth, perfect for mountain life. Tea arrived in Tibet via trade with Chinese provinces like Sichuan and Yunnan, sometimes carried on the backs of yaks along the treacherous tea horse road. Tibetan monasteries incorporated tea into rituals and meals. Families drank butter tea daily, offering it to guests and elders. Over centuries, tea became woven into Tibetan identity, an imported leaf transformed into a local soul food. Tea and the Mongol Empire. During the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, led by Genghis Khan and his descendants, created the largest contiguous land empire in history. This empire connected China to Europe, and tea flowed across its vast territories like never before. The Mongols themselves preferred fermented mare's milk, but they recognized the value of Chinese tea, especially among their Chinese subjects and Central Asian allies. Tea became part of diplomatic exchanges and military supplies. Mongol postal stations, called yam, were stocked with tea to refresh riders. Elite Mongol courts often served Chinese-style tea to foreign envoys. The empire's unification of trade routes allowed tea to move quickly and safely from the Far East to the Middle East, laying the groundwork for its spread into Islamic lands. Caravanserais and campfires, tea on the move. Along the Silk Road, merchants and travelers relied on caravanserais, inns built along the route to provide shelter, food, and security. These rest stops became melting pots where ideas, news, and customs were shared, and where tea was often introduced. Imagine a desert night in Samarkand or Bukhara, where camels rest, spices fill the air, and traders sip tea brewed over campfires. Conversations blend Persian, Turkic, Chinese, and Arabic, and tea becomes the quiet companion of the weary. Caravan life was hard. Long walks, harsh weather, uncertain bandits. Tea offered a moment of comfort, clarity, and shared humanity. In these caravanserais, tea was not just a drink. It was hospitality, healing, and a ritual of connection among strangers from distant lands. Central Asia's embrace of tea. As tea continued its journey, it found a warm welcome in Central Asia, regions that now include Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Tea became embedded in local life, especially in cities like Tashkent, Bukhara, and Almaty. It was served in ornate teapots with sugar, cardamom, or lemon, often poured into piala, wide, shallow bowls. Central Asians developed unique tea rituals. Tea was often poured and returned to the pot multiple times to show respect. The smallest amount was poured first as a gesture of humility. Refilling the guest's bowl before they finished drinking was considered rude, a sign to leave. Even today, green tea, Coke chai, is the drink of choice in many homes and bazaars across Central Asia. It's offered before meals, during meetings, and at every turning point in life, from births to funerals. Persia and tea's first sips in the Islamic world. Tea reached Persia, modern-day Iran, gradually. By the Safavid period, 1501 to 1736, Chinese tea had begun arriving through the Silk Road and the port of Hormuz. At first, Persians saw tea as a novelty, but it soon competed with and complemented kahveh, coffee, which had already been embraced in Persian society. Tea was seen as lighter, more refined, and easier on the body. Persian poets began to mention tea in their verses. The tea house, or chai khaneh, became a cultural institution. Storytelling, chess, and recitation took place over endless cups of tea. By the 18th century, Iran began to cultivate its own tea, especially in the lush region of Gilan, near the Caspian Sea. But even before local production, tea had become a cornerstone of Persian hospitality and daily life. The tea horse road, risk and reward. One of the most legendary paths in tea history was the tea horse road, a grueling trade route stretching from Yunnan and Sichuan to Tibet and beyond. It was named for the primary trade exchange, tea from China, horses from Tibet. The journey took weeks, sometimes months, through steep mountain passes, roaring rivers, and frozen ridges. Porters carried 100-pound tea bricks on their backs, sometimes walking barefoot or sleeping under tarps. Why endure such hardship? Because the demand for tea, especially among Tibetan communities, was immense, and the Chinese needed sturdy Tibetan war horses. The tea horse road was more than trade, it was a lifeline. Villages along the path depended on it for survival. And tea, humble yet essential, was at the center of this epic exchange. From China to Arabia, maritime tea routes. While the Silk Road moved tea overland, the maritime Silk Road carried it by sea. Chinese ships, laden with tea, porcelain, and silk, sailed from Guangzhou and Fuzhou to ports like Malacca, Calicut, and Aden. In the Islamic world, especially in port cities of the Arabian Peninsula, tea was received with interest and care. It was often blended with mint, rosewater, or spices, reflecting local tastes. Though coffee remained dominant, tea found a niche, especially in Yemen, Oman, and the Persian Gulf. Tea became part of souks, prayer gatherings, and homes. The maritime route also allowed for a two-way exchange. Chinese artisans adapted to Arab tastes, and Arab traders brought back Islamic architecture and art, which later influenced Chinese tea house design. Tea's legacy across the Silk Road. By the late medieval period, tea had firmly planted itself along the Silk Road. From the monasteries of Tibet to the bazaars of Bukhara, from the caravanserais of Persia to the tea houses of Central Asia, tea was no longer a Chinese secret. It had become a shared tradition, shaped by geography, religion, and culture. The leaf may have come from China, but the rituals, flavors, and meanings evolved wherever tea traveled. Even today, the legacy of tea along the Silk Road survives in butter tea in Tibet, green tea in Uzbekistan, cardamom tea in Iran, sweet black tea in Turkey. Each cup tells a story of trade, tolerance, and time. A story brewed over centuries, carried on camelback, and passed hand to hand, from ancient leaves to teacups. Tea in the Islamic world, tradition and transformation. Early encounters. How tea reached the Islamic world. Tea's arrival in the Islamic world was not a single event, but a slow, steady infiltration over centuries. It came both by land, via the Silk Road, and by sea through the maritime Silk Route. From Persia to Arabia, tea trickled into Muslim societies where coffee was already well established. The earliest known mentions of tea in Islamic medical texts appear during the Abbasid Caliphate, though its use remained rare. Physicians debated its effects, Was it warming or cooling? Uplifting or sedating? Some described it as a gentle tonic for digestion and alertness. Initially, tea was consumed mostly by scholars, travelers, and merchants, curious about this foreign brew from the East. But over time, as supply chains stabilized and tastes evolved, tea began to find its way into homes, markets, and spiritual gatherings. In the beginning, it was not a replacement for coffee, but rather a parallel pleasure, one that brought its own rituals, flavors, and meanings. Persian passion, Iran's embrace of tea culture. Among Islamic cultures, Persia, modern-day Iran, embraced tea most passionately. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Chinese tea had become a staple import. But it wasn't until the late 1800s that tea became central to Persian identity. A Persian diplomat, Prince Kashef al-Sultaneh, is credited with smuggling tea plants out of India, under British control, and beginning cultivation in Jalan, a lush region near the Caspian Sea. His dream: make Persia self-sufficient in tea. Persian tea culture developed its own flavor. Tea is brewed dark and strong. It's often poured into glass cups, letting the rich amber color shine. Served with lumps of sugar, gand, or nabat, rock candy. The glass is held to the light to admire the hue, a subtle art. The chai-khaneh, tea house, became a cultural institution. Men gathered there to drink tea, discuss poetry, play backgammon, and listen to epic recitations from the Shahnameh. Even today, Iran ranks among the top tea-consuming nations. In Persian homes, tea is served almost constantly, at breakfast, after meals, during mourning, at weddings, with guests, and alone. Sufi mysticism and the teacup. Tea also found a home in the spiritual world of Sufism. While the Sufis are best known for their whirling dervishes and poetry of love, their daily life involved practical rituals, including tea. Many Sufi lodges, khanakas, across the Islamic world used tea during gatherings of dhikr, remembrance of God. After long sessions of chanting or meditation, tea was offered to soothe the throat and mind. It was not simply a drink, it was part of a spiritual rhythm. The preparation was done mindfully. The sharing of tea symbolized equality and humility. Sipping it in silence mirrored the inward turning of the heart. Some orders, like the Naqshbandi or Chishti, made tea a centerpiece of their communal hospitality. Over time, the cup of tea became a bridge between body and soul, between host and guest. The rise of the chai-khana, social hubs in the Muslim world. As tea became more accessible, the chai-khana, tea house, emerged as a key social space across the Islamic world. From Tehran to Tashkent, from Istanbul to Cairo, these venues became gathering spots for the people. Unlike Western cafés, chai-khanas had a more communal, slower-paced atmosphere. Patrons sat on carpets or benches, shared pots of tea, and discussed everything from philosophy to politics, poetry to prayer. In many towns, the chai-khana became a center of male society, a place where elders debated, youths played games, and poets tested verses. Tea acted as the binding thread of these exchanges. Over centuries, the chai-khana culture spread and evolved. In Central Asia, they served green tea in piala bowls. In the Middle East, strong black tea with sugar cubes was the norm. In North Africa, sweet mint tea dominated. Each region added its own accent to the universal language of tea. Tea versus coffee, a quiet rivalry. The Islamic world has long had a deep love for coffee, which originated in Yemen and spread quickly through Mecca, Cairo, and beyond. But as tea arrived, it quietly began to challenge coffee's dominance. The rivalry wasn't hostile, it was more a matter of mood and moment. Coffee was seen as sharp, stimulating, even intense. Tea, by contrast, was calming, social, and meditative. Whereas coffee houses, cafés, often attracted louder debate and energy, tea houses exuded calm. Tea became the drink of poets, mystics, and quiet thinkers. Tea also gained ground in fasting cultures. It was gentler on the stomach and a perfect beverage for iftar, breaking the fast, during Ramadan. Gradually, tea secured its own place, not as a rival to coffee, but as its gentle sibling in the Islamic beverage family. North African traditions, mint tea and ritual. In Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, tea took on a uniquely green and fragrant form, Maghribi mint tea. This tea, brewed with gunpowder green tea, fresh spearmint, and copious sugar, became the defining drink of hospitality and culture. The preparation is often ceremonial. Boiled in a metal pot, poured from a height to create foam, served in delicate glasses. In Moroccan homes, the tea tray is sacred. Offering tea to a guest is an honor. Refusing it is considered rude. There's even a poetic saying, "The first glass is as gentle as life, the second as strong as love, the third as bitter as death." Tea here is not just a drink. It is conversation, identity, and love poured into glass. Turkish tea, black, bold, and beautiful. Tea reached Turkey relatively late but quickly became a national obsession. Introduced in the 19th century, Turkish tea, ki, is made with strong black tea from rice on the Black Sea coast. It's brewed in a two-tiered teapot, saydank. Water boils in the bottom pot. Loose tea steeps on top, creating a potent concentrate. When served, it's diluted according to taste, ask, light, or koyu, dark. The tea is poured into tulip-shaped glasses, allowing the drinker to admire its deep red color. In Turkey, tea is ubiquitous. Offered in homes, offices, bazaars, on ferries, at bus stops. Served during weddings, funerals, and business deals. Street vendors carry silver trays stacked with glasses, weaving through Istanbul's crowds. To refuse Turkish tea is to refuse connection. It's a national expression of care, warmth, and rhythm. Egypt and the Levant, sweet black tea for every occasion. In Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, tea is usually black and sweet. Known as shai, it's brewed strong and sweetened generously, sometimes flavored with mint, cloves, or sage. Egyptian hours, cafés, are lined with shy drinkers playing dominoes or watching the world go by. In the Levant, tea is often offered with pitta, olives, or pastries. Despite the region's deep coffee tradition, especially Turkish coffee, tea has carved out a comforting niche. It is often served in the morning for alertness, after meals for digestion, during visits as a gesture of welcome. Tea here is less about ceremony and more about daily life, a steady pulse in the rhythm of the day. Tea in the Arabian Gulf, fusion and simplicity. In the Gulf states, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, tea arrived through trade with India and Persia. It evolved into a hybrid style, reflecting both Arab and South Asian influences. Common styles include karak chai, strong tea with milk, sugar, and cardamom from Indian influence. Zanjabil, tea brewed with ginger, especially in Oman. Light, unsweetened tea served after heavy meals or during meetings. In homes, tea is often offered alongside Arabic coffee, kahwa, and dates, especially during Ramadan or Eid. It's part of the hospitality ritual, offering warmth in both hands and words. In this region, tea is less formal, but still deeply woven into the cultural fabric of generosity and social connection. Transformation and continuity. Tea in the modern Islamic world. Today, tea remains a unifying thread across the vast diversity of the Islamic world. Whether it's sipped in a glass in Tehran, a bowl in Tashkent, a silver pot in Fez, or a key glass in Istanbul, tea speaks the language of community, calm, and continuity. Modern innovations, teabags, instant blends, cafés, have changed how tea is consumed. But in many Muslim-majority countries, traditional preparation methods still thrive. Tea continues to mark hospitality to guests, spiritual pauses during the day, transitions between work and rest, celebrations and mourning alike. In a world that changes rapidly, tea remains a ritual of stillness, a slow pour in a fast age, a quiet companion in noisy times. Tea in Europe, from exotic curiosity to daily habit. First European encounters with tea. In the early 1600s, tea was a mystery to Europeans, a product spoken of in vague terms by travelers from China and Japan. The Portuguese and Dutch were among the first to taste and transport it. Portuguese missionaries in Macau reported a strange bitter infusion used in local rituals. The Dutch East India Company began importing tea into Amsterdam by 1610. Early tea was expensive, exotic, and limited to the elite. Tea appeared in apothecaries before dining rooms, marketed as medicine. Physicians debated whether it cooled the body or upset the humors. Descriptions of tea often confused it with herbal concoctions. Recipes advised boiling tea leaves with milk or spices. European palates found the bitterness unfamiliar. Still, the allure of the East enchanted nobility and scholars. Tea was consumed more for novelty than necessity. Tea was not yet a daily drink. It was a whisper from a distant land, held with both curiosity and caution. Britain's love affair with tea begins. Britain's tea story started in the mid-1600s, quietly but permanently. The first recorded sale of tea in Britain occurred in 1657, in a London coffee house. Thomas Garway sold it at Garraway's Coffee House, touting health benefits. Tea was first marketed to men of science and trade. King Charles II's Portuguese bride, Catherine of Braganza, brought the tea habit to court. Her influence turned tea into a fashionable elite drink. Tea became a symbol of refinement and class. Aristocratic women began hosting tea gatherings. Tea sets, delicate china, and teapots became prized possessions. The East India Company became the main supplier. By 1700, Londoners were buying tea by the pound. What began as aristocratic indulgence became a national obsession. Britain didn't just adopt tea, it transformed it into a cultural pillar. Tea and class, from elite tables to working homes. In Europe, tea started as a luxury of the upper class. But over centuries, it seeped into every layer of society. Initially, tea was served in drawing rooms and salons. The cost of tea, sugar, and porcelain made it exclusive. Smuggling and adulteration made tea accessible to the middle class. Counterfeit tea, or smouch, became common among the poor. By the 1800s, price drops allowed working families to afford it. Afternoon tea rituals were adapted into simpler home practices. Industrial workers drank tea for warmth and energy. Tea houses opened for factory girls and city workers. Tea breaks became a factory staple. By Victorian times, tea had crossed all class barriers. Tea in Europe had become the great equalizer, a small luxury in every hand. The East India Company and the business of tea. Tea's rise in Europe was driven by commerce as much as culture. And no entity shaped this more than the British East India Company. The EIC secured monopoly rights for tea imports. Chinese teas, oolong, green, black, were shipped in great quantities. Profits from tea funded military expansion and colonial control. The tea trade influenced European policy in Asia. Fortunes were made and empires built on tea. Smuggling networks challenged company dominance. The taxation of tea led to political revolt, e.g., Boston Tea Party. Tea became a symbol of both wealth and oppression. The EIC later began cultivating tea in India to break Chinese reliance. Tea trade was not just commerce, it was imperial power steeped in porcelain. The East India Company made tea a tool of empire, blending leaves with law and loot. The Dutch and French tea experiences. Though Britain dominated tea history, other European nations also cultivated their own relationships with tea. The Dutch were among the first to import and sell tea. Dutch citizens in the 1600s drank tea for health and curiosity. French aristocrats sipped tea in salons, alongside chocolate and coffee. Madame de Sévigné famously debated the merits of tea. In France, tea was seen as stylish but never essential. Parisian pharmacies sold tea as a digestion aid. French colonial expansion later brought tea to Africa and the Caribbean. Dutch colonial rule introduced tea to Indonesia and Suriname. The French Revolution disrupted elite tea-drinking habits. Today, tea holds a quieter place in Dutch and French life. In these nations, tea remained a cultural guest, never quite stealing the show. Russia's tea story, samovars and Silk Roads. Russia's tea journey came over land, not sea. By the late 1600s, caravans from China were hauling tea bricks across Mongolia and Siberia. The Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 formalized tea trade with China. Caravans took months to reach Moscow, but the demand was high. Russians preferred black tea, strong and fragrant. The samovar became the symbol of Russian tea culture. Samovars heated water continually for family or guests. Tea was drunk slowly, often with sugar cubes held in the mouth. The Romanovs hosted elaborate tea ceremonies. Tea was used in Orthodox fasting periods. Even in Siberia, tea was a hearthside companion. In Russia, tea meant warmth, ritual, and home. The Russian teacup was not delicate. It was resilient, like its drinkers. Afternoon tea and the British ritual of refinement. In the 1840s, a new tea ritual was born in Britain, afternoon tea, thanks to the Duchess of Bedford. Late dinners left long gaps of hunger in the day. The Duchess began inviting friends for tea and snacks at 4 p.m. Soon, afternoon tea became a fashion among the upper class. Delicate sandwiches, scones, and cakes accompanied the tea. Tea gowns were designed for the ritual. Parlors were rearranged for graceful tea settings. Etiquette guides outlined proper tea manners. The ritual emphasized leisure, grace, and femininity. Hotels and tea rooms adopted the style for public life. Afternoon tea became a timeless British tradition, still alive today. It was more than a snack. It was a gentle pause in a hurried world. The tea house and café culture of Europe. While Britain developed the tea ritual at home, continental Europe explored tea in public spaces. France's Café Procope served tea to philosophers and poets. Austrian cafes offered tea alongside pastries and newspapers. Germany preferred strong black teas with sugar and cream. Eastern Europe developed cozy tea salons in cities like Budapest. Polish intellectuals gathered over tea and literature. Spanish cafes sold tea more modestly, often overshadowed by coffee. Bohemian artists saw tea as a nonconformist choice. Tea houses became symbols of quiet rebellion and reflection. Some cafes offered tea readings and mysticism. Europe's cafes were not just about coffee. They were open to tea's embrace. In candlelight corners and wooden booths, tea nourished Europe's quieter souls. Tea, literature, and European imagination. Tea did not only warm the body, it inspired the mind. Writers, poets, and painters found meaning in its steam. Jane Austen's characters frequently gathered for tea. Charles Dickens wrote tea scenes to show intimacy and order. Virginia Woolf pondered the stillness of teacups. Oscar Wilde celebrated tea as civilization itself. Marcel Proust's Madeleine moment was soaked in tea. Tolstoy's Russia was never far from a samovar. Tea scenes marked domestic calm amid story chaos. Poets used tea metaphors to explore time and emotion. Painters captured teacups in still life and impressionism. Tea became a literary companion, quiet and constant. Few objects are as storied, drawn, and spoken of as a humble teacup. The modern European tea scene. Today, Europe's tea culture continues to evolve, balancing tradition and trend. British tea remains tied to national identity. Herbal and fruit infusions are rising in popularity. Health-conscious consumers embrace green and white teas. European cafes now offer chai lattes, matcha, and bubble tea. Specialty tea houses have opened in Paris, Berlin, and Madrid. Organic, fair trade, and artisanal teas are in demand. Afternoon tea has become an experience for tourists. Eastern European samovar traditions survive in families. Younger generations explore tea as a lifestyle and aesthetic. Tea in Europe is now both heritage and innovation. The old teacups still clink gently, but the brews inside are always evolving. The rise of the East India Company. Let us begin in silence, with the slow churning of the sea, and the soft creak of wood against wood, as ships begin to leave English harbors. In the year 1600, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a royal charter was granted, a document written in elegant ink on parchment, bearing a single, powerful idea, to form a trading company. And so, the Honorable East India Company was born. At first, it was a modest venture. A few wooden vessels, a handful of merchants and sailors, their eyes fixed on the fabled riches of the East, spices, silk, and porcelain. But within a century, this company would not remain just a trading outfit. It would grow into a monstrous force, a private empire with its own army, its own bureaucracy, and its own interests, and soon, it would wield a power no other corporation in history had ever known. Among the many goods it desired, one in particular stood out: tea. A curious beverage from China, rumored to bring clarity, calm, and stimulation all at once. Tea was rare, expensive, and exotic. The English elite adored it. It had mystery. It had charm. It had value. But the East India Company wanted more than value. It wanted monopoly. By the 1700s, the company had embedded itself deeply into global trade routes. China became its primary focus for tea acquisition. It sought to import vast quantities into England, and by doing so, it created a demand that far outpaced supply. Tea was no longer a novelty. It had become a necessity. China's trade policies and the Canton system. Now, drift with me across the sea, to the coastline of southern China, to a harbor that lay calm beneath gray skies, Canton, known today as Guangzhou. By the 18th century, the Chinese government had grown wary of foreign influence. They established strict limitations, forcing all foreign trade to take place through this single port. It was the only legal gateway for British merchants, and it was heavily controlled. This was the Canton system, a carefully designed economic and cultural shield. Foreign traders were not allowed to live freely in China. They could not learn the language, travel inland, or interact with local people beyond their designated brokers. The trade was handled through a group of Chinese merchants called the Cohong, and everything was regulated with precision. But most importantly, the Chinese wanted only one thing in exchange for their tea: silver. The British, flush with ambition, soon realized they had a problem. They loved tea. They wanted more of it. But the silver required to buy it was flowing out of Britain at an alarming rate. The trade imbalance grew year by year. A cup of tea came with a cost the empire could no longer ignore. Thus began a search, not for tea, but for something China wanted. The opium trade begins. The answer, as history tells us, came from India, a land already under the East India Company's growing control. In the fertile fields of Bengal and Bihar, the British began cultivating opium on a massive scale. They processed it, packed it, and shipped it, not to Britain, but to China. Opium, a potent narcotic, was officially banned in China. Yet its effects were inescapable. It calmed pain. It brought dreams. It dulled sorrow. And soon, it created addiction. The trade was illegal under Chinese law, but the British found ways to smuggle it in, quietly, steadily, using third-party agents and foreign ports. The silver that once left England for Chinese tea now returned to Britain through Chinese addiction. Tea funded the addiction, and addiction funded the tea. It was, perhaps, one of the darkest barter systems ever to be constructed in the name of trade. The First Opium War. History, even in its quietest corners, is full of loud consequences. By 1839, the Chinese emperor had seen enough. His appointed commissioner, Lin Zexu, issued a stern letter to Queen Victoria, urging the British Crown to end the opium trade. There was no reply. Instead, Lin Zexu led a crackdown. Thousands of chests of opium were seized and destroyed, not sold, not confiscated, but poured into the sea near Canton in a dramatic display of national resistance. Britain responded not with diplomacy, but with war. The First Opium War began in 1839. British gunboats, with superior weaponry, devastated the Chinese coastline. Cities fell. Ports were taken. Resistance crumbled. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed. It was the first of the so-called unequal treaties. Britain was granted access to new ports, exemption from Chinese laws, and ownership of Hong Kong. Trade resumed. Tea flowed freely. But the cost had been devastating. The once proud Chinese empire had been humbled. The Boston Tea Party and the American Rebellion. Now let us cross the ocean, to a different empire, and a different rebellion. The year is 1773. In the American colonies, resentment against British taxation is growing. The East India Company, drowning in surplus tea and near financial collapse, is granted a special concession by Parliament. It may sell tea directly to the colonies, without paying tax in Britain, undercutting local merchants. To the colonists, this is tyranny disguised as charity. On a cold December night in Boston, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians board British ships. They silently open 342 chests of East India Company tea and tip them into the harbor. This was not just protest. This was revolution. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party, and it served as a spark, one of the most symbolic acts that led to the American War of Independence. Tea, once a beverage of comfort, had become a catalyst for freedom. The dawn of the tea factory. Let us begin in the quiet dawn, where mist hugs the slopes of a remote tea estate, where once every leaf was plucked and processed by hand. In the earliest days of tea cultivation outside China, in the wild, rolling hills of Assam and Darjeeling, tea was more art than industry. Leaves were hand-plucked, withered under the sun, and rolled between palms. Oxidation was judged by sight and smell. Drying was done over charcoal, and every batch was as unique as the hands that made it. But as demand grew, not just in London's parlors, but across the world, something had to change. And so, in the mid-19th century, the British planters introduced the first tea factories, not massive at first, but functional. Inside simple brick buildings, lined with wooden beams and tin roofs, the stages of tea production began to formalize. There were drying troughs, rolling tables, and small furnaces. Leaves passed from one room to the next like actors in a quiet play. Still, everything was slow. Everything was personal. But outside these walls, the world was hurtling forward. The Industrial Revolution was changing everything, from cotton to coal, from ships to steam. And soon, it would change tea forever. Rolling machines and the birth of CTC. The first major breakthrough in tea mechanization came with the invention of the tea rolling machine. Invented in the 1870s and improved throughout the 1880s, this machine mimicked what workers had done by hand, twisting and bruising the leaves to release their natural enzymes and juices, allowing fermentation to begin. Instead of a person manually rolling small handfuls, a single machine could process hundreds of pounds of leaves in a day. The rhythm was mechanical, precise, and unrelenting. The hum of gears replaced the rustle of hands. But it was only the beginning. In the 1930s, in Assam, a new method was born, one that would redefine mass-market tea forever. It was called CTC, crush, tear, curl. This machine-based method did exactly what its name suggests. Leaves were not gently rolled but shredded into tiny granules. It was faster, cheaper, consistent. CTC tea brewed quickly, gave a strong color, and had a robust flavor that blended perfectly with milk and sugar, perfect for the rising popularity of chai in India and teabags in the West. Art gave way to efficiency, and tea, once a handcrafted luxury, became a standardized product. The steam engine and tea transportation. While machines inside the factories transformed how tea was made, steam power transformed how it was moved. In the mid-19th century, the construction of railways across India and Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, changed everything. Where once chests of tea were carried by bullock carts or boats, they now traveled by rail, faster, safer, and more reliably. The British-built rail network connected the remote tea gardens to the ports of Calcutta, Madras, and Colombo. From there, steamships carried them to London, Liverpool, and beyond. This wasn't just logistical convenience. It was industrial synergy. Tea didn't sit for weeks in tropical heat anymore. It arrived fresher. The timing of auctions became more precise. The rhythms of tea production, sale, and consumption synchronized like gears in a machine. The steam engine had connected the leaf to the cup. Teabag invention and the rise of convenience. In 1908, in the bustling streets of New York City, an accidental innovation occurred. One that would forever change how millions of people drank tea. A tea importer named Thomas Sullivan began sending samples to customers in small silk bags, expecting them to empty the leaves into a pot. But many customers misunderstood. They simply dunked the entire bag into hot water, and to everyone's surprise, it worked. Thus, the teabag was born. Over the following decades, manufacturers began designing bags specifically for brewing, first made of gauze, then paper. The design evolved: square bags, round bags, pyramid-shaped bags. Machines were developed to fill, seal, and package thousands of teabags per hour. In the post-war era, the teabag exploded in popularity, especially in the United States and Britain. It was easy, fast, and clean. Soil was depleted. Biodiversity suffered. Workers remained underpaid, often with few rights. And climate change brought unpredictable rain, pest infestations, and shifting growing zones. In response, the tea industry began to shift. Slowly, at first. Fair trade certifications emerged, ensuring better wages and conditions for laborious. Organic farming returned to old practices: composting, handweeding, natural pest control. Major brands pledged transparency and sustainability. NGOs partnered with smallholders to restore forests and ecosystems. Even packaging changed. Biodegradable teabags, recyclable tins, zero-waste goals. At the same time, new technologies began to help: solar-powered dryers, AI-driven plucking robots, climate-resilient tea cultivars. The industry was embracing smart tea. And consumers, increasingly aware, began to ask harder questions. Where did this tea come from? Who grew it? Was it ethical? Tea's future was no longer just about flavor, but impact. And as the world sipped its morning brew, the silent hope remained: that even in industry, there could be care. That behind every box, every cup, there might be balance. Between machine and nature, profit and people, past and future. Tea in the East, China, Japan, and the art of the leaf. Origins in the mist, tea in ancient China. Imagine a time before memory, where the mountains are cloaked in morning mist and the air carries the soft scent of camphor and earth. Here, in the cradles of ancient Yunnan and Sichuan, tea first grew wild and free. In ancient China, tea was not merely discovered, it was remembered, passed down in whispers and stories. One legend, perhaps the most enduring, speaks of Emperor Shennong, the divine healer of myth, who lived around 2737 BCE. As he boiled his drinking water beneath a tree, a few leaves drifted into his pot. The resulting brew was clear, fragrant, and restorative. Tea, they said, had found its first admirer. But in truth, tea's early life was deeply medicinal. In dusty scrolls like the Shennong Ben Cao Jing, tea was described as a bitter herb that brightens the eyes, quenches thirst, and drives away sleep. It was prescribed not just for clarity of mind, but for body and spirit alike. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, tea was no longer just a wild leaf, it was a cultivated treasure. Imperial courtiers sipped it. Monks meditated with it. Farmers harvested it carefully from terraced hills. In the hush of bamboo forests and temple gardens, tea had begun its long journey, not just through dynasties, but through hearts. The Tang Dynasty and the birth of tea culture. During the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, something extraordinary happened. Tea leapt from its practical roots and became an art form. The Tang period was one of openness and elegance. Silk flowed through the hands of poets. Ceramics glowed in dragon kilns. Buddhism and Taoism whispered through the corridors of quiet monasteries. And into this refined atmosphere, tea found its soul. The method of preparation changed. No longer were leaves simply boiled. They were steamed, pressed into bricks, and ground into fine powder. The powder was whisked with hot water in wide bowls, creating a frothy, bright green elixir. It was during this golden age that Lu Yu, a quiet scholar and tea devotee, penned the Charging, the classic of tea. This was not just a manual. It was a meditation. Lu Yu wrote about the best water to use, the ideal shape of cups, the significance of surroundings. He urged drinkers to observe, to listen, to slow down. Tea was no longer about quenching thirst. It was about awakening spirit. In Lu Yu's hands, tea became sacred. Song Dynasty elegance, whisked tea an aesthetic ritual. With the arrival of the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, tea became even more refined, almost ethereal. Song tea culture embraced the powdered form wholeheartedly. Tea competitions became fashionable in aristocratic circles. Guests would gather to compare the foam, the whiteness, the purity of their brews. It was an age obsessed with detail, with precision, with aesthetic perfection. The bowls used in these rituals were carefully chosen. The most prized were black-glazed jianware, their dark surfaces setting off the green tea's pale froth in stark contrast. There were no teabags, no teaspoons, only rhythm. Tea was whisked in a circular motion using bamboo brushes, in silence or with gentle poetry recited. The act became almost calligraphic, a dance between wrist, water, and breath. Even emperors took part. It was a time when tea was no longer consumed, it was performed. Zen and the samurai, tea reaches Japan. While China refined the art, it was Japan that gave it spirit. Tea first arrived in Japan during the Noro period, 710 to 794 CE, brought by monks returning from study in China. But it was during the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333 CE, that tea embedded itself into the Japanese soul. The key figure here was Izai, a Zen monk who brought back not only powdered tea, but the belief that tea could aid meditation. In his book, Kissa Yojoki, Drinking Tea for Health, Izai wrote that tea was the elixir of the soul and protector of the heart. From monasteries, tea spread to samurai estates, where it was valued for its clarity and focus, perfect for a warrior's mind. The ritualized preparation became a form of mind training. Each movement, each breath, was deliberate. This laid the foundation for the way of tea, not a ceremony, but a path. And on this path, Japan would walk for centuries. The Chanoyu, the Japanese tea ceremony. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Japanese Chanoyu, the way of tea, reached its most profound expression. At its heart was Sen no Reiki, the legendary tea master whose influence still echoes across Japan today. Reiki stripped tea of excess. He replaced gold cups with rustic bowls, marble halls with mud-walled huts. His four principles, WA, harmony, K, respect, SEI, purity, and Jaku, tranquility, guided every motion. A tea gathering under Reiki's guidance was more than refreshment. It was a spiritual cleansing. Guests entered a small tea hut through a low door, symbolizing humility. Inside, the world was silent but for water bubbling, bamboo ladles stirring, and wind breathing through pine needles. The tea itself was matcha, finely ground green tea whisked into a velvety suspension. It was not sweet, not perfumed. It was honest, grassy, bitter, and green. Every detail, the scroll on the wall, the placement of flowers, the crack in the cup, was intentional. In Chanoyu, imperfection was beautiful, and silence spoke volumes. Tea in the East, China, Japan, and the art of the leaf. Buddhist monks and the meditative leaf. In the stillness of early morning temples, before the clang of bells or the murmurs of chanting, monks would sip tea, not for flavor, not for ceremony, but for clarity. Tea and Buddhism had long shared a quiet alliance. In Chan monasteries in China and Zen temples in Japan, tea was not considered luxury but discipline. It aided wakefulness during hours of zazen, seated meditation. It kept the body warm in unheated cloisters. It offered pause in the rhythm of silent work. Monks prepared tea with deliberate care, using the same concentration they applied to sweeping courtyards or copying sutras. Every act was meditation. Every sip a reflection. There are tales of monks drying and storing leaves meticulously, preparing their own ceramic cups, and grinding tea with small hand stones. Even the simplest tea became a spiritual mirror. In Japan, this relationship deepened through wabi-sabi, the beauty found in simplicity, imperfection, and transience. A chipped bowl was not discarded. It was revered. Tea, like life, was fleeting, and that made it sacred. The tools of the East, bowls, brushes, and iron pots. In Eastern tea, the tools mattered, not for their luxury, but for their presence. Each item used in the preparation and presentation of tea had meaning, purpose, and quiet poetry. The chorin, A tea bowl, often simple and asymmetrical, cupped gently in the hand. Each curve, each glaze told a story. Some were smooth and elegant, others rough like bark or stone. The chasen, a bamboo whisk, delicately carved, with hundreds of thin tines. It transformed powdered tea into liquid cloud. The chishaku, a slender scoop used to measure the matcha, carved from a single piece of bamboo, passed down through generations. The tetsubin, a cast-iron kettle, often with a quiet pinecone or lotus motif, used to boil water and warm hearts. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was trivial. Even the cloths used to clean the tools, the natsum, the fukusa, were handled with reverence. Folded a certain way. Held just so. To watch a master prepare tea in the East was to witness sculpture in motion, movements slow, curved, and soft. The leaf was the center, but the tools were its orbit. Poetry, philosophy, and the art of tea. Eastern tea was never just drunk. It was written about, sung, and painted. In China, the Tang and Song poets sang of tea's fragrance like a lover's breath. Lu Tong, in his famous 7 Bowls of Tea, described how each cup took him further into reflection, until the 7th bowl lifted him to the immortals. The first cup moistens my lips and throat. The 7th I dare not drink, for I am borne on the wings of a gentle breeze, back to my sacred mountains. In Japan, the way of tea was guided by the writings of masters, the scrolls that hung in the tea room, brief, profound words that echoed in the silence. Haiku poets captured tea's quiet heart. A single teacup, still warm in my quiet hands. Autumn leaves drifting. Even in calligraphy, tea left its mark. Characters brushed with water instead of ink, fading as they dried, like memory. The tea room was a canvas, the leaf a brush, and the moment the masterpiece. Modern interpretations, Eastern tea today. In today's bustling cities, from Kyoto to Shanghai, tea is still drunk, still cherished. But it has changed, too. Matcha lattes hum in cafés beside glowing screens. Ceramic bowls now share shelves with glass teapots and steel infusers. Young people drink bubble tea on bicycles. Offices serve green tea from vending machines. And yet, something remains. In Tokyo, old tea houses still sit hidden down narrow alleys. Shoji doors slide open to reveal a tatami mat room. Steam curls from a cast-iron pot. Silence returns. In rural China, farmers still handpick spring buds before dawn, drying them gently in bamboo trays under the sun. In Taiwan, artisans roll oolong leaves by hand, a practice passed through a dozen grandmothers. Even in modernity, the essence lingers. The whisper of boiling water, the hush of whisk against bowl, the breath before the sip. The world races forward, but tea waits, preserving the spirit, tradition in a changing world. The world is changing. Fast. But in quiet corners of East Asia, the spirit of tea is still tended, like a bonsai carefully pruned. In Japan, schools like Urasenk teach the way of tea just as they have for centuries. Young students kneel, fold cloths, bow deeply, and learn the gentle code of the tea room. In China, tea masters teach the gong fu style to curious travelers and eager locals alike. The dance of tiny pots, the blooming of oolong leaves, the graceful arc of a pour. Governments recognize the value too, listing tea traditions as intangible cultural heritage. Even online, tea finds a new home. Videos of whisking matcha, of pouring from clay pots, of steaming longjing, gather millions of views. The ritual becomes digital. The reverence, somehow, remains. Because no matter how modern life becomes, we still seek pause, still crave stillness. And tea, humble, ancient tea, remains the key. Tea in the West, from aristocracy to everyday brew. First encounters, Europe meets the leaf. The story begins with ships, great, creaking wooden vessels slicing through storm-tossed seas, bound from the coasts of China to the far harbors of Europe. In the early 17th century, Portuguese and Dutch traders became the first Europeans to lay eyes and lips on the strange and fragrant leaf called cha. To them, it was exotic, bittersweet, green or black, depending on the journey. The Dutch East India Company brought the first recorded shipments of tea to Europe around 1610, landing in the Netherlands. Initially, it was viewed not as a drink, but a curiosity, something to show guests, a conversation starter. Only the wealthiest sipped it, not in mugs, but in delicate porcelain cups, often imported from Jingdezhen in China. As the 1600s wore on, the leaf made its slow march westward, trickling into courtly circles in France, Germany, and eventually England. It was not yet a drink for the people. It was still foreign, still expensive, still unfamiliar. But that would soon change. The English obsession begins. In 1662, an alliance of royal families forever altered the course of Western tea culture. That year, Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, married King Charles II of England. She brought with her a dowry of spices, gold, and crates of tea. More importantly, Catherine brought the habit of tea drinking. A queen sipping tea made it instantly fashionable at the English court. Ladies began taking it at breakfast, in the drawing room, before and after letters. Gentlemen followed. Tea became a social lubricant, a way to gather, to gossip, to reflect. Tea houses began to emerge, first for aristocrats, then merchants, and soon, for nearly everyone. By the dawn of the 18th century, London's elite were captivated. And the leaf, once foreign, had become a national fascination. Tea and the rise of the British Empire. As the British Empire expanded, so did its thirst, for power, for profit, and for tea. By the early 1700s, the British East India Company had grown into one of the most powerful commercial empires in history. It dealt in spices, silk, and, increasingly, tea. But tea was expensive. To pay for it, Britain traded silver, a costly commodity. Seeking alternatives, the British turned to another export: opium, grown in India, and traded illegally in China. This trade imbalance would sow seeds of war, but for now, tea was booming. Tea was taxed heavily, up to 119% in the mid-1700s, making it a luxury once more. Smuggling flourished. Entire coastal communities in Cornwall and Kent turned to illicit tea trade, hiding bricks of black leaf beneath barrels of fish. Still, demand never waned. Whether by honest import or shadowy moonlight, tea flowed into Britain in vast quantities. By the late 18th century, it had moved from the parlors of nobles to the firesides of cobblers, farmers, and chimney sweeps. A nation of tea drinkers had emerged. Tea and the drawing room, rituals of the elite. While tea had become widespread, its etiquette still reflected the world of lace gloves, high collars, and polished silver. In aristocratic drawing rooms, tea was ceremony. A lady of the house would invite guests for afternoon tea, a tradition often attributed to Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, in the early 1800s. She reportedly complained of a sinking feeling in the afternoon and requested tea with a light snack. Soon, this became a fashionable habit: delicate finger sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, sponge cakes, and, of course, fine black tea served in bone china. The tea table became a stage, the hostess its actor. The tray, the sugar tongs, the milk jug, all part of a well-rehearsed ritual. Even tea gardens emerged, sprawling outdoor venues where music played, paths wound between flowers, and couples strolled between sips. Tea was not merely drunk. It was displayed. Industrialization and the democratization of tea. As the Industrial Revolution took hold in the 19th century, life in Britain changed forever. Workers toiled long hours in factories, mills, and mines. The days were loud, dirty, demanding. And yet, in the chaos of clanking machines and soot-streaked cities, tea became a moment of comfort. It was warm, calming, filling. By the mid-1800s, tea had become affordable enough for working-class families. It was often served with bread and margarine, a cheap but sustaining meal. Teapots sat on coal stoves. Children fetched hot water from neighborhood kettles. Even in the darkest corners of industrial cities, tea remained a civilizing force. In the workplace, short breaks for tea began, the early seeds of the tea break culture. And while aristocrats still sipped Darjeeling under chandeliers, laborious clutched mugs of strong Assam in candlelit tenements. Tea was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. Tea in the West, from aristocracy to everyday brew. Tea and the American Revolution, a brew for rebellion. The story of tea in the West would not be complete without pausing and lingering on the calm, misty harbors of colonial America, just before they erupted into rebellion. The year is 1773, and the streets of Boston are quiet but tense. Carriages rattle along cobblestones. Sailors offload crates at the wharf. And among these ordinary sights, one object appears again and again: the wooden chest. Inside, dried leaves. Black, crumbling, fragrant. Tea. By this time, tea was as much a part of life in the American colonies as it was in London. From New York parlors to Charleston farmhouses, people drank tea at sunrise, at supper, and during community meetings. It was comfort. It was connection. It was Britishness in a cup. But beneath that warm familiarity, change was brewing. For years, the British Crown, through the powerful East India Company, had maintained a monopoly on tea imports. This monopoly wasn't just about commerce. It was about control, and it placed unbearable financial pressure on colonists who had no say in how they were governed. In May of 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies without colonial middlemen, undercutting local merchants. Though it actually lowered the price of tea, the colonists saw it for what it was, a symbol of dominance. In drawing rooms and taverns, the talk turned bitter. Not about the drink, but about what it represented. To continue drinking this tea was to submit, sip by sip, to imperial power. The phrase "no taxation without representation" echoed from mouth to mouth like steam rising from a kettle. And then, one night in December, cold, grey, and quiet, something unusual happened. Under cover of darkness, a group of men dressed as Mohawk warriors boarded British ships docked in Boston Harbor. These men, members of the Sons of Liberty, carried no weapons, only resolve. One by one, they heaved 342 chests of tea, nearly 45 tons, into the black water below. The harbor rippled, and the world changed. This was the Boston Tea Party, an act not of violence but of symbolic resistance. A rejection not only of taxation, but of empire. The tea leaves that had traveled across oceans now drifted silently under the moonlit surface, an offering to the future. Back in England, the act was seen as vandalism. In America, it became legend. And what's most interesting is what happened to tea after that. Many colonists, eager to sever ties with Britain, began boycotting tea altogether. Some turned to herbal infusions made from native plants, mint, sage, sassafras, or Liberty tea made from raspberry leaves. Anything but the taxed leaf. Tea, once a symbol of refinement and loyalty to the crown, had become a revolutionary flashpoint. For years, it remained a drink of quiet controversy. And yet, as time passed, and as America emerged as its own nation, the relationship to tea softened once more. Though it never quite regained the same central place as in British society, it remained a quiet ritual in homes across the new republic. But coffee, cheaper and untaxed, rose to prominence in the United States. Thus, the legacy of the Boston Tea Party lived on not just in history books, but in the morning mugs of millions of Americans who reached for beans instead of leaves. It was a small rebellion with a lingering aftertaste. Even now, centuries later, the phrase Boston Tea Party conjures images of defiance, of barrels crashing into dark waters, of smoke on the horizon and whispers in the taverns. It is strange to think that a plant, a small, rolled leaf, could carry so much meaning, that a cup of tea could be a line in the sand. But it was. And in that moment, tea was not just a beverage. It was a banner. Victorian tea time, the rituals of refinement. The Victorian era, a time of towering hats and tapering waistlines, of gaslit drawing rooms and velvet-covered furniture, was also the golden age of tea as a ritual of refinement. In the long shadow of the Industrial Revolution, amid the fog of expanding cities and the clang of machinery, a different kind of world existed behind the doors of respectable middle and upper-class homes. It was quieter, gentler, and filled with the sound of silver spoons tapping china teacups. It is in this world that afternoon tea was born. To understand this ritual, we must first understand its architect, Anna Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford. In the 1840s, Anna found herself troubled by what she called a sinking feeling during the long hours between lunch and dinner, which, in those days, was often served at 8 o'clock in the evening. Her solution? A small repast in the afternoon, a pot of tea, served with bread and butter, or perhaps a small cake. At first, it was a private pleasure, but soon, Anna began inviting friends to join her. These gatherings grew in popularity among London society women, who would dress in their finest and gather in drawing rooms to partake in this elegant interlude. Thus, the ritual of afternoon tea was born. Not just a cup and a biscuit, but an orchestrated social occasion. There were teapots made of silver or porcelain, often perched upon warming stands with tiny flames below. There were cups and saucers, delicate and sometimes hand-painted, passed carefully from hand to hand. There were sugar tongs, used to place exact cubes of sugar, never heaped, into teacups. And there was milk, added after the tea had been poured, never before. This was more than custom. It was code. The table, too, became a stage. Laid with lace or embroidered linen, it held tiered trays of sandwiches, cucumber, egg and cress, smoked salmon, with the crusts cut off. Beside them, scones, warm and round, to be split and layered with clotted cream and strawberry jam. And finally, an array of cakes, Victoria sponge, Battenberg, Madeira, each as meticulously crafted as the hostess's manners. But this was not just about food or drink. It was about status and self-presentation and repose. To host a successful tea was to demonstrate one's gentility. To pour tea without spilling, to pass a plate with grace, to know when and how to stir, all of these things signaled one's refinement. Even the conversation followed an unspoken rhythm, soft, measured, avoiding politics or business. Instead, guests spoke of weather, literature, fashion, or mutual acquaintances. Words were chosen carefully, like the fine china from which they drank. Tea was, in effect, a performance. And yet, it was also a comfort, a moment of stillness amid the rush of Victorian life. For women especially, whose worlds were often confined to domestic spaces, it offered an outlet. A gathering, a connection. As the ritual gained popularity, it moved beyond private homes. Soon, tea shops appeared, respectable places where women could meet without a male escort, something previously frowned upon in public society. These tea rooms, often attached to department stores, became sanctuaries. Safe, genteel, and above all, feminine. By the late 19th century, afternoon tea had become a cultural cornerstone. But there was also high tea, a different tradition altogether. Unlike afternoon tea, which was a light refreshment between meals, high tea was a substantial evening meal, served in working-class homes. It included meat pies, boiled eggs, pickled vegetables, bread, and, of course, tea. The term high referred not to elegance but to the height of the table, a dining table, not a low drawing-room one. Thus, the two teas, afternoon and high, mirrored the two halves of Victorian society. One was delicate, refined, and ritualized. The other, hearty, practical, and sustaining. But both shared one thing, tea itself, as a daily anchor. Back in the parlors of the well-to-do, tea equipment evolved with the age. There were tea caddies with locking lids, to keep servants from pilfering the precious leaves. There were infusers, strainers, and slop bowls, for discarding leftover dregs. Some households employed a tea mistress, typically the lady of the house, who controlled the serving of tea with solemn dignity. No one else dared pour. Even the tea dress became a category of fashion, looser, flowing gowns worn only during these in-between hours, allowing the hostess to remain elegant but comfortable. The tea table, then, became a theater of femininity, a space where power was subtle, and influence was brewed leaf by leaf. We must not forget the role of servants in these ceremonies. Behind every polished teapot stood someone who cleaned, carried, arranged, and prepared, often without recognition. The Victorian tea ritual, like much of the era, was sustained by invisible hands. As the 19th century drew to a close, the world was beginning to shift. Industry surged. The empire expanded. And yet, in parlors lit by gas lamps, the ritual of tea remained, delicate, dependable, and defining. It was a ritual of restraint, of rhythm, of reverence for small pleasures. And it told the world, here is a nation that finds dignity in its tea time. War and rationing, tea in times of conflict. When the world is at war, every ordinary thing takes on new meaning. A loaf of bread becomes sustenance. A letter becomes hope. And a simple cup of tea becomes a lifeline. Let us now drift backward, to a world under grey skies and blackouts. To the quiet clink of tin cups in trenches. To the ration lines. To the bomb shelters. To the First and Second World Wars, and to the quiet comfort tea brought through it all. Tea in the First World War. The year is 1914. Europe is at war. Young men, boys, really, are being sent to the Western Front. They live in dugouts and ditches. The mud is thick. The air is sharp. And the waiting stretches on. Amid the chaos and terror, tea becomes more than just a drink. It is warmth. It is familiarity. It is, for many soldiers, the last thread connecting them to home. The British Army, understanding this, makes tea an official ration. Every soldier is issued tea leaves, not bags, not yet, and encouraged to brew it whenever possible. Boiling water is fetched or begged or scrounged. Tin mugs blackened by fire are filled. Sugar, when available, is added with gratitude. It is a slow ritual in an otherwise violent world. For soldiers at the front, tea becomes a kind of pause. A moment of stillness in the noise. When the shelling stops, they light small fires. They gather around kettles. They wait for the water to bubble. And they talk. Tea becomes the silence between words. The comfort in camaraderie. And back home, too, tea is essential. Women in Britain form volunteer groups, like the Women's Institute, to send packages to troops. These often include tins of tea. Some even contain small strainers or wrapped sugar cubes. It is a lifeline. Dry leaves wrapped in brown paper and hope. Tea in the Second World War. Now let us walk forward in time. The year is 1939. Once again, the world descends into war. But this time, it is not only the front lines that feel it. It is every home, every shop, every port, and every city. And again, tea is there. In Britain, tea is declared a national priority. So much so, in fact, that the Ministry of Food secures special shipments. Even with German U-boats prowling the Atlantic, convoys of ships carry tea, under armed guard, from India and Ceylon to British shores. Why? Because tea is more than nutrition. It is morale. In air raid shelters, when sirens wail and families huddle underground, tea is poured from large kettles by volunteers. Steam rises through the cold. Children sip slowly. Adults stare ahead, hands wrapped around cups. It becomes a way to say, we're still here. The British government even forms the Tea Control Board, regulating imports, pricing, and distribution. Every adult is allowed 2 ounces of tea per week under the rationing system, about 25 cups. Scarce, but sacred. Milk is also rationed, and sugar too. Many adapt by drinking black tea, or switching to mash, a strong brew, often made by stewing the leaves much longer than recommended. In the factories, the army camps, and the offices, tea breaks are institutionalized. At 11 a.m. and again mid-afternoon, workers stop. They step away. They sip. Even Churchill himself, aware of the psychological importance of tea, demanded it be preserved at all costs. Tea wasn't just a drink. It was resistance in a teacup. Across the empire. In the colonies of the British Empire, tea also played its part. In India, local labor still harvested and processed the tea destined for wartime Britain, even as independence movements stirred and unrest grew. In Australia, soldiers brewed billy tea, named for the small metal pots they used. In Canada, tea was shared during cold nights and long marches. And in Africa, colonial workers continued the long chain of production. Tea's journey in wartime wasn't just from leaf to pot, but from empire to soldier, and back again. Tea and the Red Cross. Tea also played a humanitarian role during the wars. The Red Cross often included tea in its aid parcels, especially those sent to prisoners of war. For men captured behind enemy lines, tea was often the first taste of comfort in a world that had become brutal and uncertain. Veterans would later recall that nothing lifted spirits like a hot mug of tea in a freezing camp, even when it was weak and sugarless. Tea and women on the home front. At home, women were tasked with keeping morale high. One way they did so was through the make-do and mend spirit, reusing tea leaves, stretching rations, and inventing new recipes like tea bread made with dried fruit soaked in cold tea. Tea wasn't just consumed, it was woven into the rhythm of wartime domestic life. Housewives lined up for their weekly rations, often queuing in the early hours to get the best share. Neighbors shared when one household ran short. It became a quiet thread of solidarity. Language and slang. Even the language of war absorbed tea. In the British Army, brewing up meant preparing tea, and cha, short for chawala, the Indian term for a tea vendor, became a slang word for tea itself. Soldiers often wrote home asking simply, "Send more cha." And so they did. Tea in wartime propaganda. The British government knew that tea was more than morale. It was identity. Propaganda posters from the 1940s featured women in aprons and men in uniform, both smiling as they sipped tea. One famous poster showed a woman holding a teacup with the words, "Tea, the cup that cheers." It was subtle, but powerful. After the war, even after the final victory parades and peace treaties, tea remained rationed in Britain until 1952. For nearly a decade after World War II ended, the nation continued to brew its daily cup carefully, patiently, and with gratitude. Tea had survived the Blitz, the blackout, the shortages, and it had carried with it the calm assurance that life, even when broken, could be steeped again. In times of conflict, people cling to what is familiar, and tea, in all its simplicity, became a ritual of endurance. Whether in a soldier's trembling hand or a mother's chipped cup, it stood as proof that something gentle remained. Lovely, let's continue our gentle journey through tea's evolving story. In the world of tea, few things have been as quietly revolutionary, or as quietly controversial, as the tea bag. It is small, unassuming, and familiar. A square or round pouch, often with a paper tag and a string. You dip it in, let it steep, and you're done. But this convenience was not always the norm. Nor was it universally welcome when it arrived. To understand the rise of the tea bag, we must return to a time of loose leaves, porcelain strainers, and ritual, and then watch, slowly, as industry, convenience, and modern life reshaped the very nature of tea. The age of loose leaf. Before the tea bag, all tea was made using loose leaves. This meant measuring out the tea, usually a spoonful per person, placing it into a teapot, and allowing it to steep before straining. The process was tactile, deliberate, and in many ways, ceremonial. It allowed the drinker to see the tea leaves unfold, to smell them, to watch the color deepen. In households across Britain, America, and much of the Western world, this was the norm, whether in the drawing room of a Victorian home or the kitchenette of a 1920s flat. But as the 20th century unfolded, something was about to shift, quietly, and with almost no fanfare. The accidental invention. The tea bag, as it turns out, was not born out of a eureka moment. It was a happy accident. Around 1908, a New York tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan began sending out small silk sachets filled with tea samples to clients. His intention was that customers would empty the sachets into their teapots and brew as usual. But many misunderstood. They assumed the entire sachet was meant to be placed directly in the water, and so they did. To Sullivan's surprise, he began receiving requests for more tea bags. He quickly saw the potential and began experimenting with cheaper, more porous materials, moving from silk to gauze, and eventually to paper. Thus, the modern tea bag was born. Not with trumpets or marketing campaigns, but with quiet utility. Evolution of the tea bag. The earliest tea bags were hand-sewn and resembled small sacks. Over time, manufacturers developed machines to automate the process. In the 1920s and 1930s, tea bags became more common in the United States, especially in hotels and restaurants where speed and tidiness were valued. They were practical. No loose leaves. No strainers. No fuss. By the mid-20th century, companies like Lipton, Tetley, and Twinings were experimenting with various designs. Single-chamber bags, which floated awkwardly and brewed unevenly. Double-chamber bags, introduced by Tetley in 1953, which allowed more water to circulate. Heat-sealed paper, which replaced the stitched gauze of earlier versions. Tagged strings, for easy dipping and removal. It was innovation in miniature, all focused on making tea faster, neater, and easier. British reluctance. Interestingly, tea bags were slow to catch on in Britain, the spiritual home of the teapot. As late as the 1950s and 60s, many Britons viewed tea bags with suspicion, as a sign of laziness or poor taste. Real tea, they said, was brewed in a pot. Loose leaves were superior. Bags were for cafeterias and Americans. Some called them dust bags, pointing out that tea bags often used fannings, the tiny, broken bits of leaves left over from the sorting process. They argued that this produced a flat, lifeless brew, lacking the nuance and depth of full-leaf teas. And in some ways, they weren't wrong. But the world was changing. The age of convenience. The post-war years brought modern kitchens, microwaves, instant coffee, and ready meals. Time was short. Space was limited. Simplicity was king. And so, slowly, even in the most tradition-bound households, tea bags found a place. By the 1970s, they had become mainstream. They appeared in lunchrooms, offices, factories, schools. They were handed out on trains, in hospitals, at meetings, in waiting rooms. They were clean, quick, consistent. You didn't need a teapot, or a strainer, or time. Just a cup, a kettle, and a moment. Global spread. From Britain to Australia, from Canada to the Caribbean, tea bags traveled. In Asia, where tea had been a ceremonial art for centuries, tea bags were adopted more selectively, used for convenience, but never as a replacement for traditional methods. In the Middle East and North Africa, loose leaf still reigned, often steeped in ornate metal pots and shared communally. But in the West, the teabag revolution was unstoppable. By the 1990s, more than 90% of tea consumed in the UK came from bags. Quality and the craft revival. In recent years, ready-to-drink bottled teas, both sweetened and unsweetened. Tea concentrates and powders, especially matcha and chai mixes. Bubble tea, boba, a Taiwanese invention now found worldwide, often with tapioca pearls and fruit flavors. Functional teas, marketed with claims of detoxing, calming, energizing, or boosting immunity. In major cities, you might walk into a specialty tea shop offering hundreds of varieties. In supermarkets, tea aisles have expanded to include herbal blends, international imports, and even cold brew kits. Tea has become both mainstream and niche, as ordinary as a mug of breakfast tea and as curated as a single estate oolong. Tea and technology. Modern technology has brought tea into the digital age. Tea brands now operate with sleek websites, subscription boxes, and Instagram-ready packaging. Influencers share tea moments, soft sunlight, ceramic mugs, and delicate steam, all filtered and aesthetic. There are tea brewing apps, smart kettles that heat water to precise temperatures, and online tea ceremonies streamed from remote corners of the world. One can order hand-rolled white tea from Fujian or high-altitude Nepalese oolong with just a few taps. Even AI-generated tea blends exist now, formulas created by analyzing flavor profiles and user preferences. It is a far cry from the slow caravans of the Silk Road. And yet, the essence is unchanged. Hot water, leaves, time, wellness, and the mindful cup. In the age of mindfulness, tea has become more than refreshment. It has become therapy. People brew tea not just for the caffeine, but for the ritual. The quiet clink of the spoon. The swirl of color. The slow inhale of steam. The pause. Tea is part of morning routines, journaling sessions, yoga practices, and wind-down rituals. Herbal teas, in particular, have seen a renaissance. Chamomile, peppermint, rooibos, hibiscus, ginger, turmeric, lemon balm. Caffeine-free and comforting, they offer a kind of sleepy sanctuary. Brands now label teas with moods: sleep, calm, focus, energy. It is no longer just about taste. It is about how the tea makes you feel. And increasingly, the act of brewing tea itself is framed as self-care, sustainability, and ethics. Modern tea drinkers ask questions. Where did this tea come from? Who picked these leaves? Was it farmed sustainably? Is the packaging compostable? As awareness grows, so too does the desire for transparency and ethics. Many brands now offer fair trade certified teas, organic teas grown without pesticides, single origin teas with detailed harvest information, plastic-free bags and compostable wrappers. Some consumers are even turning to local herbs and native plants, exploring homegrown tea alternatives like nettle, mint, or elderflower. There is a subtle shift towards slower, smaller, and cleaner tea. Tea in culture and conversation. Tea remains a social drink, though the settings have changed. In cafés and homes, tea is served during meetings, catch-ups, book clubs, and therapy sessions. It's offered to guests, shared between co-workers, and sipped in solitude. In many cultures, it is still deeply ceremonial, from Japanese chinoyu to Moroccan mint tea pouring, to British afternoon tea with scones and jam. Even in TV shows and memes, tea shows up, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as a statement. Spill the tea means to share gossip. A cup of tea is a shorthand for comfort. Tea time is still instantly recognizable worldwide. Tea is not just a drink. It's an invitation to pause. Tea in education and exploration. More people are now becoming tea learners, attending tea tastings, watching YouTube videos about tea history, perhaps like your viewers, reading books on tea farming, water chemistry, and brewing techniques, visiting tea growing regions for tea tourism. There are even tea sommeliers, certified experts who study aroma, leaf shape, and regional terroir. In many ways, tea has gone from the background of life to a subject of study. And for some, it has become a lifelong passion, bridging the past and present. What is most beautiful about tea today is that it exists on a spectrum. It can be made in seconds, or in silence. It can be a bag in a microwave mug, or a ceremony with hand-thrown clay. It can be corporate, artisanal, ancient, or new. It welcomes the curious and the tired, the busy and the still. It is both ordinary and sacred, depending on how you sip it. The timeless leaf. And so, we close this long, steeped journey, from ancient China to modern cafes, from imperial courts to tiny apartment kitchens. Tea, in its modern form, is no longer just British, or Chinese, or Indian, or Japanese. It is, quite simply, human. In every steaming cup, we find echoes of centuries past, and the soft stirrings of the present moment. It is still, after all this time, a cup of leaves and water. But oh, what a journey it has taken to get here.